Namaste, this is Aditya and welcome to Shankar Mark channel. Headless CMSs are gaining popularity nowadays. Hence, in this video, I am going to explain various out-of-the-box options given by AEM to use AEM as a headless CMS. And in the end, I am also going to explain my point of view on what is the best way to use AEM as headless CMS. This video will be useful for architects and tech leads. If you are liking the videos which I am doing, please hit on that like button and please subscribe to my channel. Let's get started with the presentation. Okay, so first let us try to understand what is CMS. Okay, this in the left hand side we are seeing an example of a static way of developing a site. Okay, so the developer will code this HTML code, and the text which has to be ultimately displayed or rendered on the website, he'll just type into the code and it will be rendered like this, right? So this is the standard procedure or general static way of developing it without a content management system. And this site ultimately will be maintained by the marketing team. And let us suppose if there is any text change which they have to do, they always need to depend upon the developer. So they'll have to ask the developer to change the text and he will have to go into the code and change it, and only then it will reflect, right? So this is the dependency which we are leaving on the developer always. So to avoid this, we have come up with this content management system, wherein we say there will be an author from the marketing team and he will add the content to the content management system, and this paragraph will be stored in the content management system. Okay, so whatever text they have entered directly in this HTML code, that will be instead saved in the content management system. And in the HTML code, we will get the content from the content management system and put it here as a variable. And ultimately, this will be rendered. So this is the use of the content management system. Okay, so we know that AEM is good in this, right? So then what is a headless CMS? So that's what we are going to understand now. Whenever we are developing a website, there are two parts to it. One is the content part and second is the experience part, right? So if you take this button as the example, the text button is the content, and how that button is rendered in the UI, the color, the shadows and everything, right? So that is the experience part. So the experience part, we are coding it through this HTML and also the CSS and sometimes the JavaScript, right? How exactly the user will interact and how exactly the design is of that button, the look and feel of that button, and how the user will interact with that particular button, right? All this comes under experience part. And just the text which has to be displayed comes under the content part, right? So now if our content management system is assuming that this content which we are displaying, this button, content button, right? So this button which we are displaying is in the HTML format, then it is a headful CMS. Then what is headless CMS? So headless CMS does not make any assumption. So it will send the text in a plain format, in a plain text format, which can be used by any of the devices in any of the format, not only HTML, but it can be used in the mobile apps, it can be used in IoT devices, it can be used in big TV screens. On any of these devices, in any language, you can use this text which is being returned. So the output format of this particular text will be in the JSON format. Okay, so this kind of CMSs does not assume the output format to be in a certain way. Okay, instead it will send it in a JSON format which can be consumed by any of these devices. Okay, so if you don't know what is the output format and how exactly the experience part is, using which coding language you are creating the experience of a particular button or a particular element, if you don't know that, or if the CMS doesn't assume anything regarding that, then that kind of CMSs are called as headless CMSs. Okay, now let's see what all ways in which AEM can be used. Okay, so if you see this, AEM can be used as a headful CMS. This we already know, because AEM by definition itself is Adobe Experience Manager, which means that you not only manage the content but you also manage the experience part of it. And that experience management assumes that your output format will be in HTML format. So since it has made that assumption, it is a headful CMS. Okay, so whatever code we are writing in the AEM components, we write the HTML code, right? And we do CSS on it and we write the JavaScript. So we already made the assumption that this is going to be displayed only in the HTML formats. So that is why it is called as headful CMS. And another thing is hybrid headless CMS. Okay, this is hybrid CMS, which means that this also makes an assumption that it is the output format is still the HTML format. The assumption is still not gone. Okay, and you will be able to manage the experience in AEM itself. But the only thing is you can display it in the mobile devices also. Okay, so for example, the single page application, if you develop, then you can embed that single page application into the app as a web view or into the mobile app as a web view, and there will not be any page reload or page refresh in the single page application. So still it feels like as if you are using a mobile application. So in that way you can make the content which is stored in AEM adaptable to even mobile devices, but still the assumption that the content will be rendered in the HTML format only is not gone here. Hence it is a hybrid CMS. Okay, so then what is a pure headless CMS? So the pure headless CMS not only considers the mobile part of it, but it also considers all devices, like for example IoT devices, big screens, everything. So the output format here will be the plain text or JSON format, so that any device can consume this. So if it is designed in that way, then it is pure headless CMS. Okay, so AEM gives us an option to use AEM as any one of these. Okay, so let's try to understand what are the differentiating factors which differentiate each of these things, and whenever we are making a architecture decision on how to use AEM, then what all consideration do we need to make? So that's what we are going to discuss now. Okay, so then first thing is the tech stack. So we need to consider the tech stack because we need people for the development. We need certain skill sets. So what all skill sets are needed to develop a particular website using, if we have to use AEM in a particular way? So that consideration we need to make. And then we need to see what is the authoring experience. Okay, so we'll go about more detail in our next slides. Okay, so then what is the output content format which we are expecting? So this is required because we need to think as to whether the output format will be HTML or not. If we are, for example, taking about a native mobile app, then the output format won't be the HTML format, right? It cannot consume like that. Okay, so we need to think of what all output formats we can allow. Okay, so then what is the routing ownership? So whenever you are navigating from one screen to another screen, so you are using certain URL or navigation IDs. So then who is taking the ownership as to what content has to be rendered or what code has to be executed? So who is taking ownership on this? Is it AEM or not? So that consideration also we need to make. And finally, what are the pros and cons of each of the approach? So these are the differentiating factors which are available for each of these approach. So let's discuss these one by one. So this is the headful way of doing it, and we all know it. The tech stack is Java, Sling framework and OSJ framework. So any Java experienced guy should be able to deal with this. And authoring experience, will get inline authoring experience, which means that if there is a text here, hello world, then author will be able to edit this text inline. So it is an what you see is what you get kind of editor. So immediately you edit the change and you see how it reflects on the device. Okay, so that is what is given in headful CMS. And if you see the content delivery format, it already made an assumption that it is HTML format, which is the final output rendering format. Okay, so that's why we all code the components in HTML, JavaScript and CSS, right? And then the routing ownership lies with AEM. Okay, so what is the routing ownership? So if you see here, all the content structure is maintained in the AEM. Okay, and if you see this, the user will hit a URL, it will come to dispatcher. So this is a short URL, and then the short URL will be converted into the long URL, and that long URL will be available in the publish instance, and this URL is nothing but the site structure which we have created in the AEM. So this is how the routing will be done in the headful flow, which we already know. Okay, so it is all lying with AEM. So that's what we are talking about here. And then the pros and cons works very well with HTML based devices and not with others, right? So all this approach will work only for the websites which are opened only in the browsers. So you can make it responsive to be adaptable to the mobile devices also, but still you will have to open the browser and only you can access it. Even if you want to put this as a web view in the mobile app, it doesn't look good, because on each click or each page navigation, the entire page reloads, right? So that is how the headful way work. Like if you just go from home page to some contact us page, then entire page reloads, and then the new contact us page will get loaded. So you will not have the native kind of experience if you embed this as a web view in the mobile app. Okay, so these are all the drawbacks of the Headful CMS. So you can only use this Headful CMS if you want to make a site for which can be opened in the browsers. So next we will see using AEM as hybrid CMS, in which the first thing is AEM SPA Editor, which means that single page application. Okay, so you can develop a single page application, and AEM has out of the box single page application editor using which you can do the inline editing. Okay, so let's see the differentiating factors first. Okay, so the tech stack, you have to use either Angular or React. Okay, so to develop these applications, so you need that skill set, and you need core AEM tech stack, like what is the Java, how to create the Java models, Sling models, and rest of the things. So then coming to the authoring experience part, you will still have the inline authoring. So using the AEM single page application editor, you will still be able to open and edit and change this text inline. Okay, so still you will have the what you see is what you get editor, and you will be able to open it, change it, and immediately see the effect of it. Okay, so then the content delivery format is JSON. Now let us try to understand how this AEM single page application editor works. Okay, so if you see here again, there is a content structure which we have created, right? Similar to this in AEM SPA applications also, we can create the content structure. So if we just go to any of the page in CRXDE and open the JCR content, what you see is all the components, all the AEM components which are added as part of this page. And if you go on to each of the components which are added as part of that page, what you see is what are the dialog box properties which you have selected on that particular component. And what you don't see is any of the code, right? So actually in the content path, you don't see any code. All you see is just the what are components are added, and on each component what is the dialog box properties which are selected, and each component will be referred to the actual code location, right? Where exactly using the Sling resource type, we will mention the for this particular component the code is here, but in the content path itself the code is not there. Only the dialog box properties are there, and at the page level what all components are added as part of that page is there, right? So this is the first understanding which you need to have. Then with that understanding, let's try to understand how is this single page application working. Okay, so whenever you are loading a page, what is being loaded is actually a single page application. It is not that you are just editing, you are just selecting this page and editing it as you are doing it in a normal AEM application. So these pages are not individual pages. Okay, so whatever page you open, it opens only single page application. So it just opens one single page application. So the single page application, how does it work? Let's try to understand that. Okay, so here is the user and this is the device. So single page application is always running on a particular device, right? It is single page application is nothing but a JavaScript. Okay, so you write the entire code, you compile it, and ultimately a JavaScript file will be created, and that JavaScript file will be running on the device, right? So whenever you hit a URL, the URL will be routed. So that URL will be routed to a particular component, to a particular page component, and that page component will render that particular page. So here also in SPA also you will have a routing mechanism. Okay, whenever a URL is entered by the user, then that URL you will create a routes, right? If this URL is there, then load this page component, and this URL is coming, load this page component. Like that you will tell in the single page application also. So whenever that URL comes up, then it goes to that particular page component, and in that particular page component, in the single page application also, you will say what all components it has to render in that particular page. So it is almost similar to how you will do it in the AEM, right? This also has a routing part, and this also has for each component what page to render. But here the catch with the AEM SPA, when you are combining these two, what is the advantage you are getting? Okay, so whenever you are hitting a URL, like whatever URL you hit, you always go to one page component. Okay, and that page component will dynamically loop through an array and dynamically render the components. So what is that array? That array is the list of the page components available in that particular page. Okay, so let us suppose he is saying /home. He's hitting like /home. Then it will route only to one component, one page component. Even if he is hitting /contact us, it will route to the same page component. Then how is it differentiating from what components have to be loaded on the home page versus what components have to be loaded on the contact us? How is it able to differentiate? It is able to differentiate because that page component which is available in the SPA is getting what all list of components are there on that particular page from AEM. Okay, so if you come back here again, let us suppose this is the home page. In CRXD, if we go in this home page, what all components should be added? We already have it as part of CRXD in the /content folder, right? So that list of components will be passed on to this AEM SPA application. And then based on those components, the SPA application will do the rendering. But now we should get a doubt, right? These are AEM components. Then how come this AEM component is being rendered by the SPA? So what we do is we create something called as mapping. Okay, so we create an AEM component and we map it to an Angular component. There is a syntax for it. Okay, and how do we map it? What is the unique identifier? The unique identifier again is the Sling resource type. So all the components which are added on the page are being injected to the SPA as an array, right? So it will loop through the array and see what all components are there, and for that it will see the Sling resource type, and each of this AEM SPA component will be mapped to one of the Sling resource type. So based on the Sling resource type, it will choose what single page application component to render, and it will be rendered. So the page component which is available at the SPA level is dynamic. It is not static. Okay, so dynamically it will get the list of the components from the AEM, and then accordingly that will render. So the approach here is you will create the SPA component and you will have to create the AEM component. Then you will have to map this AEM component to SPA component. And similarly, we will have to create a page. So as I told already, this page component in single page application will loop through an array, and based on the Sling resource type, it will identify what all components it has to load and render. So it is just a single page component. Okay, and then this page component will be mapped to the AEM page component. Now how does it map? So whenever a request is coming to this particular single page application which is residing on this device, it will get a URL, right? The request comes in the format of URL. Let us suppose it is coming as hostname/homepage. So first it will hit the router configuration which you have configured on the SPA, right? Then it will go and load the page component, right? And that it is just a single page component. For every request, only single page component is loaded, and then that page component will send that URL and hit this dispatcher. Okay, and here you have this homepage.html. So right, this is the URL which is coming to the dispatcher. Now this dispatcher will convert it to the long URL like this. right? And it will hit the publish instance, and then publish will send back all the list of the components which are available as part of the home page as a JSON. Then it will go back to this page component. Then page component will loop through and render these components based on the Sling resource type. Okay, so that's how this entire flow works. Okay, so that is why we say here that the routing ownership will lie with the AEM, which means that you still have to create this site structure, and based on the page path it will return the exact content. So that's why we say that routing ownership here lies with AEM. So whenever we are thinking to use AEM in this way, right, as a hybrid CMS, we need to consider three things. Okay, so three kinds of components we need to consider. So we are actually creating the component code in a single page application, right? So whenever we are creating a single page application, you might have to create three kinds of components. So what are those? The components which are completely dependent on the external entities other than AEM. Okay, so for example, there could be a single page application component which is dependent completely on the commerce system, and it may not have any requirement to get any data from AEM. So such kind of components also will be there in the single page applications. And there could be some other kind of components which are partly dependent on AEM. Like for example, there could be some content which is coming from AEM and some content from the commerce system or other CRM system, and then this component has to combine both of them and render it. So that also could be one of the scenario. And the third scenario is AEM content, which is this SPA component is completely dependent upon this AEM content. So these are the three kinds of components which could exist. And for each of these components, we need to create a wrapping AEM component. Okay, so whenever we are adding the component here, let us suppose we are adding a component which is completely dependent upon the external entity. It is not dependent anything on AEM. Nothing is coming from AEM. No content is coming from AEM. Still, we have to create a wrapper component so that authors can add that component. And that component may not have any dialog box to edit, because there is no content dependency on the AEM, right, for that particular component. It is all coming from the commerce APIs. So we just are creating a component so that authors can add that component on the page. And once authors add that component on the page, and whenever the request is coming here, that request will be translated to the long URL, and that URL has that commerce component also, and that's how that commerce component Sling resource type will be sent on to this SPA application, and that Sling resource type will be mapped to the SPA component, which is completely dependent on the commerce APIs. So that's why whether we have any content dependency on AEM or not, for each of the single page application component, we need to create a AEM component. Okay, so this is how it works. Okay, so now what are the pros and cons of this? So the first thing is the single page application again is based on the HTML and JavaScript. So you can use this single page application as a web view in the mobile applications. So when you use these applications, there will not be any page reload. So you still get an app-like experience while the user is navigating from one page to another page. Without a page reload, the content loads. So it still feels like an app. So an app as complete web view is accepted on Google Store, in Android Play Stores, but not in the Apple Store. So what we might have to do is we'll have to develop an application which has at least some native functionality, like some camera functionality we are using, or mic functionality you are using, or some application has to be developed which uses those native functionalities, and partly we can embed this SPA application into that Android application or Apple application. Then it will be accepted on both the Play Stores, but then it will be a design challenge. Like when you navigate from the native application to the embedded application, there should not be any design changes. Okay, so all that considerations have to be made. So these are the cons and pros and cons of this application. Okay, so still there is a dependency on the HTML, JavaScript and CSS, and also it cannot be used in the mobile application in a native way. So that is why this is a hybrid thing. And one more drawback of this is this can be done only if you are doing this SPA applications from the scratch. Like if you already have a single page application and if you just want certain content to be coming from the AEM, then you cannot use this, because here all the components have to be added as part of the AEM, and routing completely lies with AEM. So AEM is the leader here. So so the SPA is a follower. So if you already have an AEM application and to change everything from the scratch is difficult. So if you are developing from the scratch this application, and if you already know that this integration with AEM has to be done, then this would be the best approach. Okay, so these are the considerations which we need to make. Then coming to another flow, which is AEM Remote Single Page Application flow. So what is this flow is? Okay, so here we use Angular and React, and again we need to use some wrapper components in AEM. So AEM core stack is still there, and you still get the inline authoring experience here, and the content delivery format as other AEM SPA is completely JSON, but here the routing ownership lies with SPA and not with the AEM. So that's the only change here. So you can host your Angular application anywhere in the cloud you want. Like if you want to host it in Google Cloud, you can do it. If you want to host it in Azure, you can do it. You need not host it as part of AEM. So how does this work? Okay, so again, this is how it works. Whatever components, so these are the single page application components here, and whatever the component which is dependent on the AEM, only those components you create a mapping. Okay, and if it is also partly dependent on the AEM component, still you will have to create a mapping, because you need some data from the AEM, right? So still you need to create certain mapping. But if it is completely independent on other APIs, then you need not create any mapping with the AEM component. So you can just leave it like that. And the extra step which we need to do here is we need to map the SPA route to the AEM path. That mapping has to be done, so that whenever a particular URL is coming as part of this this single page application, then it should know, like it will call the AEM based on the URL which is coming to the single page application. But then when that call is made, then AEM should be able to know for this particular URL what is the corresponding AEM page it should use, and what all components are added in it, and what is that component data. To send that, it needs to have certain mapping between the SPA URL to the AEM URL. Okay, so that mapping has to be done here. So the flow here looks similar to what we have seen in AEM SPA, just that there is some difference. Okay, so your SPA is hosted on your own cloud server. Okay, this is just a JavaScript file, and ultimately whenever the application is loaded, it will reside upon the client device itself. Okay, so from the client device only all the calls are made. But the only part here is whenever the user is hitting a particular URL, earlier any URL he hit, it always used to go to one page component, right? Here that's not the case, because this Angular application is on its own. Each URL will have a routing mechanism, and each URL will be routed to one unique page component which is created on SPA. So it's not that all the routes are only pointing to one component. No, that's not the case in this particular way. So whenever the URL comes, that URL will have a route to a particular unique page component in SPA. And that SPA page could have a static set of components which have to be loaded, right? So all those are SPA components which have to be loaded. So in a static way, you might embed all those components onto that particular page, onto that particular single page application. Okay, but then what you can do is you can give an facility or a placeholder to get certain content from AEM. So you have a URL, that URL is routed to one particular page, and that page has a component list, and in that component list there could be one component which has a placeholder reference to the AEM component. And if such a component is there, only for that component the content will be fetched. And how exactly that content will be fetched? It will be fetched based on two things. One is what is the URL and what is the component name, right? So the URL is coming from whatever URL we have typed, and that URL will be passed on to the AEM, and in AEM we will create the pages. Okay, so just like we have created here, right? Like this only we will create the page structure here, and these pages in the page property will have an ability. In the page properties there will be a placeholder to map this page to the SPA page URL. Okay, so that's how we do the mapping, and whenever the single page application sends the URL, that's how it AEM knows which particular page has to be selected, and on that particular page it knows what component to be rendered, because there was a mapping between the AEM SPA component to the AEM component. It knows what component to be rendered, and it will send that particular data to this particular component. Okay, so that's how this entire flow works. Okay, so then again this also have the same dependency, that it is HTML, CSS and JavaScript based, but it is a single page application, so you can use it as a web view in your Android devices. But still that limitation of Apple versus Android Play Store is still there. So this is also a hybrid way of doing it. So the native mobile application cannot work in this way. Okay, so if you have to make AEM work for any of the device, then you have to go for the pure headless way. Okay, so the pure headless way works based on the content fragments. Okay, so any language you can use, the tech stack, okay, any language you can use, and the knowledge which you need to have on AEM is how to create the content fragments, and you need to have a little knowledge on the GraphQL. That's it. So all you need to do in the AEM is create the content fragments. And authoring experience, as you can see, is not what you see is what you get. It is just based a form based authoring. Okay, you just drag and drop the components here, and the author has no way of knowing as to how exactly this component is being rendered or this content is being rendered on a device. So that experience is lost. Okay, and the content delivery format is JSON, and routing ownership completely lies with the UI application. Okay, and the pros and cons of it is any backend application can use this. Okay, so any backend application can just give a call to this content fragment and consume the data. So that can happen. Okay, even the Android native application or Apple native application can call these content fragments, get the data in the JSON format, and then render in its own way. But the con of it is hard to manage. Once there are like thousands of content fragments, author has no idea as to which fragment should be edited and what impact it will create on the actual app, because this is not a what you see is what you get experience. So these are the different ways in which you can use AEM, and from headful to completely headless way. Okay, so my point of view on all these of different ways of using AEM is none of this is pretty good. Using AEM as Headful CMS is most powerful, and it works better for websites. Okay, so it should be used in that way only. That is my point of view, and the other hybrid ways and pure headless way is not up to the mark. But if we have to use AEM in a headless way, then my recommendation would be to create a servlet and to get the content of the page components as a JSON. So how this exactly works, we will see in upcoming videos. That's it for today. Thank you.